Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, September the 30th. Today, Keir Starmer delivers a conference speech he's been working on for months and which is pivotal to his future. Will it do the job? My name's Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. At 2 p.m, the Labour leader stands up to address the faithful in an address that will last, we're told, just over an hour. The initial version of this speech was locked down in August, I'm told, but after the Downing Street reshuffle, it was reopened and tweaked and tinkered with all the way through last week, with multiple rehearsals as well here in Liverpool.
There is a massive global story today that could squeeze coverage of the speech. However, just after 7 o'clock last night, Donald Trump announced in the White House his plan to end Israel's nearly 2-year war against Hamas in Gaza in moves that he is calling one of the great days ever in civilization.
Fear not, we are going to do a full analysis of the challenge for Keir Starmer just a little bit later in this podcast. And you're going to get a special edition of Politics and Sam and Anne's, the debrief edition, later today to go through it. But it is inescapable that the announcement from Donald Trump just needs a little bit of covering off from us, because there is a UK dimension, UK political dimension to it too. So let us just do that quickly, because you need to know it for the day ahead in British politics. The US plan, as outlined by Donald Trump, calls for an immediate ceasefire in the conflict, which is actually something to the right of the Israeli political system had been resisting, and for all the remaining hostages held in Gaza to be released within 72 hours of Israel publicly accepting the deal. Benjamin Netanyahu was standing next to Donald Trump at the White House last night. So I think we're on course for that to happen. The question is about, what does Hamas do? Hamas would be disarmed and its members granted an amnesty if they commit to peaceful coexistence and to decommission their weapons. And for those that want, there will be safe passage for Hamas to receiving countries, should those countries accept them. The plan states that no one would be forced to leave Gaza, so that is a departure from earlier discussions of that Riviera of the Middle East. And Tony Blair, Sir Tony Blair, would be amongst those on a board of peace, which is a kind of international supervisory body to oversee the deal. And there'll be a path to more involvement by the Palestinian Authority. I think this is the big tension for countries in the Middle East to get their involvement. And Arab countries will want that to happen sooner. But the big question for the next few hours is, do all sides publicly and firmly commit to this iteration of the Trump plan? And what do you make of it all?
Well, certainly we make of it that there is full alignment there in terms of what Donald Trump has agreed to in terms of the makeup of this international body, this board of peace. Obviously, Donald Trump, unsurprising, I think, to hear this, will be chairing it. We saw quite a flattering statement come out from Tony Blair, as you mentioned, who would be the first named member of that. So, it's that man again back in the forefront on a subject, I should say, Gaza and the plight of the Palestinians, which has been close to his heart for many years, and also with strong relations with Israel. So he's seen as well placed there by the White House to deliver. But bated breath on what happens now on the Hamas side. The early signals are that they would not have gone this far, I think, in the announcement without some very positive signal there coming out from Hamas sources. But on paper, all we're seeing is that Hamas has said that they are studying this, or sources who speak for Hamas are saying that they are studying this, and will let us know in due course. A lot rides on Qatar, the country that is going to be one of the main, probably the main receiving country for those who would then have to leave, for fighters or those allied to Hamas who would then need to leave and to go somewhere else under this scheme. It does still leave a big question mark in my mind, Sam, as to the deliverability of this, particularly when it comes to the hostage releases, because so much now rides on that. And we do know that Hamas is, at moments like this in the past, have tended then to have internal splits. So we're waiting really to see if there's a unified reaction there, whether there are those who are saying we don't accept this, we want to fight on.
Just to bring back the perspective to Liverpool, there are going to be nerves in Labour about this. Keir Starmer has formally and firmly backed the plan overnight, saying the plan is profoundly welcome, and I am grateful for President Trump's leadership. I can see that even that language causing conniptions throughout the Liverpool ACC. I could see David Lammy, ex-Foreign Secretary, now Justice Secretary, still Deputy Prime Minister, bristle at anything that looks like a viceroy role. He was sort of spitting that out on the Peston show on ITV last night. And I think that you got a sense of what he would be saying around the cabinet table, which is you need more Palestinian involvement quicker for this to work. That's going to be a big push. And finally, it must just be damn weird for the very many legions of people here in Liverpool who work for the Tony Blair Institute, walking around their conference, talking about ID cards and healthcare plans while watching their boss over issuing statements and about to take some kind of board job overseeing the Middle East. Look, the left still has an uneasy relationship with Tony Blair. Bits of Labour still have an uneasy relationship with Tony Blair post-Iraq. So that, I think, will be quite a strange feeling. Anyway, let's crank quite quickly over to domestic politics. Let's wrap up where we are post Rachel Reeves' speech this morning, because there's important stuff in the papers.
Rachel Reeves has given her first firm indication of some taxes that are likely to rise in the budget. She said, I do think there's a case for gambling firms paying more. She was in an interview with ITV News there. She said they make an important contribution to the economy, but they should pay their fair share of taxes. And we'll make sure that happens. That's also following up on plans that I think Gordon Brown has very much been advocating, that he would like to see. He actually wants to see more of a clampdown, I think, on gambling. And Rachel Reeves, at this point anyway, seems to be going more in the direction of seeing what revenue she can bring in from that source.
Yeah, Gordon Brown wanted to pay for the lifting the two-child benefit cap.
Well, yeah, it's a long way. It's a long way from that, but it's something.
The Chancellor's speech yesterday was just a curious affair. It made little reference to the biggest issue in her in trade, the maybe £30 billion black hole that she needs to fill, beyond an oblique warning that the UK was still facing harsh global headwinds. And in saying that she would not take risks with economic stability, their bang was the hint of tax rises. But it really is just a hint. So that's all you got from the stage. So all the interviews and then all the private chat around the side was about, well, that's a lot of taxes. What taxes? And she didn't address that from the stage. What else might be coming out?
But it really was an appearance that left one sort of filling in blanks about ourselves about what taxes she might be considering. There's one quite controversial one which is being reported that the government's considering raising VAT on private healthcare, because we're going to come on to talk about Keir Starmer using the NHS, putting the NHS and aspects of NHS modernisation at the forefront of what he's promising. But certainly there are some briefings about that broadening the VAT base and extending it from things like private school fees. Big row has been rumbling along about that, but to private medical insurance. If you add VAT there, you're going to push some people back more towards the NHS. So I suppose you can hear I'm sounding a bit skeptical about whether that actually will get across the line. But, you know, some people in the Treasury might be saying needs must when the devil drives, and that's one place where you could prospectively apply that.
So actually, mid round of morning interviews, and this is quite important, Wes Streeting has come out and ruled out that suggestion in the Mail of adding VAT to private healthcare. But I have to say, Anne, if they create a vacuum, this kind of speculation is going to happen a lot. Let's hop on to today's Keir Starmer speech. Labour released a trail overnight. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what we do know?
Yes, we know that Keir Starmer is going to foreground renewal over decline. He will say that we need a time of national unity, dignity, and reform. He will stress that there were difficult but necessary decisions ahead to rebuild public services, grow the economy, and put money back in working people's pockets. That last point is something we've been hearing a lot from those who've been close to Keir Starmer and preparing the speech, saying we need to return to something that feels very concrete for people. And that is a pledge that he knows that he needs to make if he is to reconnect with a large number of people who've simply drifted off any form of kind of belief or interest in his project. Now, I know these things are a bit of a word salad, Sam, unity, dignity, reform, etc. I think dignity, you can read there, a bit of a message, and there's some areas of policy around it is about keeping trade unions and happy and a bit more of a sense of the collective good. National unity, well, not hard to hear the patriotism message that he was talking about as we went into this conference there. And reform, i.e., things are going to change. I am not simply here to be a figurehead of the status quo. So the question really for Keir Starmer, can he nail it? Can he deliver a speech that sounds like this is not just another group of positive nouns, but is Starmerism in practice?
Because the challenge is pretty existential. As you wander around the conference, people openly talk about the possibility of a challenge in the next year, which feels incredible. And in some senses, people not here might be surprised to hear that the sort of faithful are saying that. But it's happening. And so that is the challenge that he has to overcome. And when you talk about the speech in that way, I do slightly worry, because everyone is crying out for a mission from Keir Starmer, a direction and a vision. But you can sort of try and do that, and it can end up just sounding like a word cloud, a bit like on policy. You say the right nouns, you say some verbs, passionately, strongly, relentlessly, future, grit, frustration, determination. But you don't put the verbs and the nouns in a sentence that have a subject, object, and verb, and as a result, you give sort of hints of where you're going, but it actually, a little bit like the mist with sunlight pouring through it, it sort of disintegrates in your fingers, and so that's one of the tests that I've got for this speech. Another one is just on the substance. Is there actually material substance in there? Does he say what he wants to do, how he's going to do it, and when he's going to do it? Because all the way along this conference, and we'll have more examples of this, I think, tomorrow, cabinet ministers are saying things, but I'm very unclear how they actually happen in practice. But much more worrying than that, they have little idea how they're going to work in practice. ID cards we talked about this week. There are others as well. And then the third thing is that Keir Starmer can make argument, and we hear about this challenge from reform that he's going to be talking about. But to what extent is he simply setting up straw men and then knocking them down for the pleasure of the people in the hall, rather than taking on arguments that people might find difficult? I was talking to a Labour veteran last night who was puzzling me this. He said, when did British politics just become entirely dominated by electioneering? Because what you're hearing in this speech, and there's talk of there being a squeeze message in this speech. In other words, Keir Starmer will warn about reform, but warn those who think that they might end up going to the left, and the Lib Dems and the Greens, that if they vote for a different party, they'll end up getting Nigel Farage. All of that is a squeeze message. Is the sort of thing you get in the last 3 weeks of a general election campaign, and we are 3 years plus probably from a general. And we are not talking, it seems to me, enough about early stage in a parliament plans that can be implemented through it. And we are already obsessing and pot and kettle too much about polls and too much about elections, and not enough about the things that you can do with a massive majority at this point in the parliament. So those are my challenges for the speech. What about you, Anne?
Well, 100%. And one thing I've just noticed, you get a kind of bat hearing for certain things if you spend days around conferences. I was interviewing John Healey, the Defence Secretary, yesterday, chunky interview on defence, but suddenly he threw into the middle of it that reform, on his telling, were hostile to the NHS. And to your point, these are these squeeze messages that you push into campaigns when you want to scare people away from that drift to reform. We know that that is where Labour is at this conference, and it is gunning for the party which has most successfully been gunning for it, which is Nigel Farage's Reform UK. But that, I think, does leave exactly the challenge that you're pointing at. I think there's also a hunger around, and I don't just mean in Labour, I just mean about people who take their politics and policy a bit seriously is just for Keir Starmer to get on and put his weight behind doing something, promising to implement something. I mean, you and I would have, our views. Everybody around here would say, like, well, I would really think it should be the NHS. Somebody else should say it should be education. You can make your choice. But what is more important to Keir Starmer than any other thing? And I think that is the big challenge today. We know he's got Tim Allen as that new head of communications, very polished, has been alongside Tony Blair, always somehow stalking this conference to prepare him.
And on Tim Allen, Anne, it gives me no pleasure to report that some special advisors have already labelled him David Brent.
Tim Allen, get in touch if you feel that the comparison is unfair. I love the Sam case. I'm just saying what I heard. David Brent. Anyway, he's got a new head of communication, probably a different style of speech prep, was really what I was trying to point out there. And trying to put what I know that he has been keen to do is put more confidence into the Starmer message and delivery, get him out there. And you say, you're the guy, you're the one with prime in front of the word minister. So does that then survive contact with the word cloud that you described? Perhaps we could just look at what we do know is going to be in the speech.
Why don't we do exactly that? Let's just look at the big policy thing that is there.
Well, to take up that challenge on substance, there is one big concrete thing here, and it would be the announcement of a flagship health reform, NHS Online, a new online hospital, which is pledged to deliver around 8.5 million extra appointments in the first 3 years of its operation. The aim there is to use AI and use an upgraded online and app presence to cut waiting lists and therefore theoretically to modernise care, though that does depend whether the waiting list cuts actually ends up in the treatment and the downstream treatment of the patient. I just point that out because once you promise appointments, you haven't really said what you're promising after the appointment. But it will be pitched as evidence of Labour's path of renewal. That word we're going to hear from Keir Starmer in contrast to opponents' models that they say will be pushing people towards private healthcare. There is still the capacity issue of where you get the healthcare from when people are being through that, but this gives them a road and a clear 3-year plan. So I suppose, as we were saying, what have you got, Keir Starmer? He will say, here's one thing I've got.
Okay, I was looking for a few more details about this NHS Online. Right, a new online hospital. So I went onto the NHS England website, who've actually released quite a lot of details on this overnight, and they explained how it would work. So when a patient has an appointment with their GP, they would then have the option of being referred to an online hospital for their specialist care. And they'd book directly through the NHS app, and then they'd have the ability to see specialists from around the country online without leaving their home or having to wait longer for a face-to-face appointment. So that's the promise, that's the boast that you get. I think that this is a tougher sell than people might realise. I've got some experience of online appointments. I'm sure a lot of people do now. And it implies that NHS specialist appointments are effectively a paper exercise because quite obviously, if you're Zooming your specialist doctor, they can't see you. There is no physical examination. And Zoom-style meetings, particularly with a doctor that you're meeting for the first time, describing something intimate, they are just much more awkward affairs. And I do have a question for the medium term. This happens in the private sector, and it all works by them just buying capacity from overseas doctors. So often you're speaking to somebody in India for whom it is 4:00 in the morning, who have the relevant qualifications sort of matched across. But it is a less good experience than I think people want from the NHS. All of these things are a slightly harder sell when you dig down into it. And so my question is, does NHS Online actually end up being a popular thing, or is it simply a degrading of NHS capacity by another means?
Well, let me put in a word for that direction of travel from Wes Streeting, who has told the health sector since he came in that he wanted that technological upgrade as kind of geeky as it sounds, but he said, if we just keep talking about taking some money that we get, it's never enough to cut waiting lists, particularly with the backlog after the pandemic and underinvestment. We're sort of going in a figure of eight round, and we've still not got a better health service, and people are still unhappy. We do have to sort of get on with the investment side of it. And so I can see the point of it here. But here's a big problem that he has, Sam. The big NHS plan overhaul, the sector is very, very skeptical about. I spent a lot of time a couple of weeks ago with health trust bosses and other very senior people around NHS England and suppliers. And what they're saying is that actually productivity, it ticked up a bit. Wes Streeting talked about that, but a lot of that is just because you were able to sort of pick which backlog issues you dealt with. This is intended, as you point out, to be transformative. It's a different way of accessing healthcare, and it means waiting lists are the thing that people really hate most, and it's intended to deal with that. What happens when they get into this system? Do they find it quite useful to have had that first contact and first appointments virtually? Well, I mean, you could argue people do seem to, they do like to use services if they're, both have the sort of funding to do so, or found them that offer that in the private sector. To me, the real risk is that it's kind of dressing up something that existed before and they're putting it on an app. Sort of an app overhaul, because you remember there are services like that were brought in, like Choose and Book, and there were actually at one point, I remember in the Blair reforms, there were 3 different ways to get the same appointment, and if you were clever you could do all 3, but that is not really more capacity. That's not really an outcome based solution. The big switch is training people to expect fewer face-to-face appointments and using online care, and then from that monitoring more of their own care if they have long-term conditions like diabetes, etc. So I think what you're trying to do is sort of train people, the patients, us, to expect more online NHS. But as you say, that's that depends on how that lands and whether they're able to make it actually look like something better than we had before.
Okay, let's leave it there. We will come back with a special edition of Politics at Sam and Anne's at probably, I don't know, round about 5 o'clock. It'll hopefully drop, where we'll have everything you need to know about the speech in 20 minutes. Look forward to speaking to you then.
See more Starmer drama. See you then.